screen. So Michelle, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So today, like Kim was saying, we are going to be talking about kind of the next steps, taking it a little bit further with IQA, so the Intelligent Query Architect. So today we're going to be going over how to use multiple business objects. Last time we were doing very simple querying where we're using really just a basic business object, things like CS contact to pull up people. Now we're going to talk about using multiple business objects, kind of taking it up, getting additional information, more detail, and kind of building on the pieces that we talked about last time. So multiple business objects, joining them together, we have to give those two or multiple business objects relationships to say how do they work together. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about doing multiple filters, so being able to do different types of filtering. This is going to be a little bit of a repeat for anyone that attended last time, but I just kind of wanted to talk briefly about IQA to kind of give you a refresher. Of course, it's the Intelligent Query Architect, and it's used really throughout iMIS to pull together data, and that's especially true in iMIS 20. It's used all over any out-of-the-box member type sites. It's used all throughout the staff site, so it pulls together data in things like lists, communications, any type of search you do, and then pulling back reporting data or even the dashboarding that is in the staff site today. Like I said, it's included in iMIS. It's no additional charge to license that. It can be used really anywhere, both in the staff site or on the member site. It uses business objects, and so when we talk about how to build the different queries, we'll be dealing with business objects rather than tables to break down the data. And we can also use this with SSRS to create nicely formatted reports. It's available to export data, so that can be done either on the staff site or if you have some need on your member site. And then it is available on the staff site only, just meaning for you guys in the back office that it isn't available on the iMIS desktop in version 20, and so that's a little bit of a change. So, like I said, we were going to build on those concepts before, so we're going to do some things like using multiple business objects. And we'll do a couple of examples. We're going to build it out, and then we're going to go back and we're going to make some additional changes, kind of incrementally build these queries. It makes it a little bit easier to kind of see where things are, and if you have any problems, you can kind of spot them in the process rather than trying to troubleshoot at the end. Makes it a little bit easier how to do joins, and then we'll talk about doing some filters as well. So we're going to talk about building some sources, and I'm going to go through a couple of slides, and then we're actually going to get into the actual building pieces. So we are going to choose the business objects and sources, and some of the commonly used ones, CS contact, orders, CS event, CS activity. We're going to use a couple of those today. You can see how they work together, and then we're going to use a third one for products. So kind of get some additional details we build on that. And so like I said, we're going to use those two for today. We're going to look for our example, a list of people, and then the activities that specifically go along with that list of people. So something to kind of think about as we're going through it. And then we're going to talk about how to join them together. And so let me do this. I'm going to drag over my instance of the staff site. And the iMIS version that you're looking at is version 20. 0.2, one of the later versions, although it's Q4, so it was released maybe about a year ago. And so this is just a demo environment, so you'll notice I have a lot of different modules, a lot of different things going on just because I have access to everything. So if you think, oh, there's got a lot going on, that's why. Because we're talking about IQA today, we're going to go into RISE and then Intelligent Query Architect. So for example, I have a little AAA folder, and just because it sorts nicely at the top, so I'm calling it that. And we're going to start with a new query. We can name this something like let's do order activity. So what I was thinking would make some sense today is we are going to look at, of course, if you think about how iMIS works, that as you purchase products, when you do a product purchase, it creates an activity. So if I want to kind of look in and see who is buying particular products and maybe what products are selling when, this might be a query that might be of some use. So I'm looking for who bought them and what are they buying is really what I'm hoping to get out of this and hoping to find within my query. So the next piece is sources, and this of course is picking out those business objects that I want to use. So I'm going to click on the Add Source button, and here is where I can either scroll through the list if I'm looking for one, or I can start typing in, I think I want something with contact, and I see, oh yes, that's right, CS Contact. So CS Contact, of course, is the person or the organization that had the activity in this case. So I'm going to be able to see the people kind of information, but then I need to see the activity information. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Source again, and this time I am going to do activity, and I'm going to do CS activity again. Now, this is where it becomes a little bit more complex than it was the last time we talked. When I went and added the second source, you can see that here, so I have CS Contact and CS Activity. So iMIS tries to, in certain cases, if it knows that these are commonly used, it will try to relate them together. And when I think about relating something together, that's in terms of thinking what's common between them. And so it says that within the CS Contact business object, so CS Contact, that iMIS ID is going to be equal to the ID in CS Activity. And because I know a little bit about the data, I'm like, yeah, that seems about right, that activities, if I think of how activities might look, that I have activities, I can have multiple activities, but they would be linked by the person. So I would be able to tell by person or by the ID. So as I look at this, I think, yep, that's okay. It kind of makes sense. And then it goes ahead and gives it the type that it thinks it should be. And in this case, it doesn't equal. One of the pieces that's a little bit more complex, and I will just say, typically when you're doing these relations, it will try to join them, and that may or may not work. If I look at this and said, oh, you know what, that doesn't seem quite right, that I might want to do something else, I can delete it and add my own. And so if you look at this and say, no, I need to relate it in a different way, kind of depending on your business object, you can delete it and make your own. What you can also do, and we'll kind of go through creating our own relation here in kind of a second step or a second pass to this, is there's this option for equals. And so if I hit the drop down there, I have multiple options here. So when it's doing this relation, or if you think about it, if you have any experience with SQL, it's similar to the how are things joined together. Typically what it'll try to do, and probably 80 to 90% of the time when you're building your queries, it's probably going to be an equals relationship. And what that really means is that it's a one-to-one relationship and return basically all the rows between the contact, all the people, and the activity when there's a match. And so example would be we're going to find all contacts with any activity record. It would pull back where every person had activity. Now, something to think about is that if I have a person, say someone new, and I had this join, that if they had no activities yet, they won't show up in my query because an equals means it has to exist in both of the business objects. So that's what that equals means. And typically that's the case where you're saying, oh, I want to find someone with specific activity. Well, if they don't have the activity, then I don't want to see them. So that's what the equals means. Like I said, that's probably 80 to 90% of the time you're going to use. The probably next most commonly used is the left join. And this is, again, similar to SQL. If I were to use a left join instead, it would say I'm going to return everything from the first source, so the CS contact, even if there are no matching rows in the second source. So for example, that query to find contacts with an activity record would return everybody in contact even if they didn't have activity at all. So that's kind of the difference between the two. So if I had somebody with no activity, if I left join them, they would show up. If I had an equal join or relation, then they would not show up. The next four kind of are different flavors of the same thing. These exist, not exist, or exist and or not exist. And I'll kind of give you a little bit of a tutorial on what they mean. So if I were to do an exist, this is going to find the rows in the first source, so all the rows in the CS contact, which do exist in the second source. So they exist in CS activity. And this isn't exactly a good example, but a better one might be something along the lines, if I were doing a query to find all contacts, so that would be contacts in Texas, who purchased the widget in the last year. And so I would be looking potentially for people that had that particular activity. And so it exists over in the other side of that. The kind of converse of the exist is, of course, not exist. And so if you think about that, it's going to find all of the rows in the first business object which do not exist in the second source. So for example, if you think about a query that finds all the contacts in Texas, so that's my contact piece, who did not attend last year's annual conference. So that's what I would have on my other relation, or I would say it doesn't exist for anyone who had attended. And I'm going to find all those people that didn't. So it's really the converse of exist. The or exists and the or not exists are slightly different in the fact that it's going to find rows in the first and second sources which exist in either. So for example, the query to find contacts with either corresponding activity or an orders record. And so it could be one or the other. It's going to bring both of the records back. And then the or not exist is very similar, finds the records in the first and second data sources, and then which does not exist in either source. So for example, something along the lines of a query to find contacts without a corresponding activity or orders record. So trying to find those outliers. So a few different ways. There are times when those might be useful. Like I said, typically it's going to be the equals or the left join that we use. And we are going to keep it at equals right now for our example today. I just wanted to make you aware of the other ones and kind of what the context is for using them. So I have my multiple business objects, and next I'm going to go to filters. So filters, like we said, we can use multiple filters. And so I think before we were just using single filters. And so this is how, again, we narrow down our data and say, oh, we're looking for everybody. What specific things are we looking for? So in this case, I am going to look, and you'll notice I have both of the fields from CS activity and all the fields from CS contact, so they're all available to me. And I'm going to look for an activity type that's equal to, and I'm going to choose order, because I'm looking for order information. In this case, I'm not going to prompt the user to choose anything. I'm just going to say, no, I'm always looking in this particular query for orders. Then what I also may want to do is maybe I am going to be concerned with, if they got a complimentary product or something like that, or didn't pay for it for whatever reason, I don't think I want to include them. So, if I scroll down, I'm going to use CS activity amount is greater than zero. And I'm not going to prompt the user for that. But what I may want to do is this would run and give me information from the beginning of time. So that seems like I would get a lot of data. Maybe what I want to do also is include where the transaction date is greater than or equal to 1/1/2008. This time I'm going to ask the user because maybe I want to run it for different time frames. I'm going to make that optional. And what's going to happen is I could have left the value blank here, and that way when the user went to run this, they would have to key in the value every time. By me entering in a value here and saying it's optional still, it'll pre-populate this value into the query parameters when I go to run the query. So it's kind of nice depending on what you're doing. If you're like kind of want to prompt the user to say, oh, this is kind of what kind of data you typically use, sometimes that's helpful. They'll allow them to make changes. Next, I'm going to pop over to the display and take a look to see what's going to be displayed here. So right off the bat, it said, typically when you have CS contact, you want to display these fields. And I'm thinking, that's probably true. Maybe some of them I do want to see, others I don't. So for me to logically put these in order, I'm going to reorder these by just changing the order here. So I chose the iMIS ID. I'm going to say that's in the first position. Then I want to see who purchased this, so I'm going to put their full name. Company, yeah, that makes sense, but I want to see the company they're with. Country, you know what, I don't care as much, so I'm going to take that out. Member type, do I care what member type they are? No, I'm just kind of looking to see who bought product. If you wanted to see something along the lines of their, what member type they are, you can do some filtering by that. Maybe the city, refresh. I'm clicking refresh every time, so it kind of reorders everything. Let's put city ahead of state logically. And refresh. But I think, oh, you know what? I also want to see some information because all I'm going to get back is people. I want to see some information about the product or the orders that we've put in. And so I'm going to change this view selected columns to instead view all the columns that are available to me. And so from here, I'm thinking, okay, within activity, maybe I want to see, well, what kind of product were they buying? So maybe I want to select the product code. Maybe I also want to see what the amount was. How much did they pay? And so let's go up here and say, oh, what did they pay for that? And I also kind of am interested in maybe the transaction date. And so that should be kind of nice as I look at that. One thing I can do is if I think, oh, you know what, I don't want it to just say state, or maybe rather than saying full name, just name is fine. The alias, again, is where it gives the column a different name. So if you only have members that are going to be in the United States, that province doesn't apply. Maybe you want to give this an alias of just state. And so that's just a nice way to rename those columns. Sorting, again, if I wanted to sort these in a particular order, I can say, yeah, let's sort by maybe the product code. Then what I can do is I may want to save this. I've done a lot of work so far, so I'm going to click on Save. And yes, it's going to save into my AAA folder. It's going to call it Order Activity. That's just fine. Now I'm going to run this. And again, it prompts me to put in a transaction date. If I wanted to say something a little bit nicer than that, we can update that information. It pre-populated the 1/1/2008, although I could change it, and then I can click on Find. So now it's returning back different transactions. And so I can see, oh, you know, we have a lot of transactions. It looks like it's sorting by product code, and here's the transaction date. So that looks like some good information. Now, as I look at this, it's like product code, G11, G15. I'm not exactly sure what that is, and so we might want to go back and get some additional detail. Now, the title of the product, if I were to go back, and I'm going to go back to define, I think, oh, you know what, let's display some more information. I want to know the product name. So, but as I look through, scroll down here, as I look through activity, I don't see anything like that. I had the product code, but I don't seem to have anything specific to what the actual name is. View transactions, user fields. That kind of clues me in if I don't find the fields that I want, that, oh, you know what, I may need to connect to another business object and include that along with my sources, so therefore I can add that to my display and maybe see the title of the product. So I'm going to jump back over to sources. And this is what I'm talking about when I say, you know, it kind of build these queries incrementally, where I got some information. I'm like, oh, you know what, that's great, but maybe I want a little bit more detail, and I kind of just keep building on it, adding to it. So if I decide, oh, you know what, there's something that's not quite right, it's easy for me to troubleshoot, that I kind of see it and kind of decide, oh, does that, you know, I think it pulls back 198 records. Does that seem right? Yeah, that seems about right. And I kind of keep going, building on it. So I can come back to source and choose add a source. And choose CS product. Now you'll notice when I did that, iMIS didn't know this time how to relate them, and it gives me a little message saying one or more sources have not been related. That keys me to say, oh, you know what, I didn't get a relationship connecting product to anything, and so I need to do something about that. So I'm going to do that right now, and I'm going to click on Custom. And then from here is where I can choose what fields I want to connect to each other. So I'm going to say that for activity, that product code in activity is going to equal the product code in CS product. And I need to make sure I hit the plus sign here, otherwise it will not save that relationship. You'll notice it added it in. It says it's custom, and that's just fine. But my message saying that I had something that wasn't related is gone now. So that tells me, oh, that's good. I won't get any crazy results. So now what I can do is I can come over to display, and now I can include, scroll down at activity, at contact, product. So the fields that are available for a product, let's go with title. I'm going to add that in. I'm going to do a refresh. And then I'm going to run the query again. I'm going to use the same date because I was returning some results, and that was good. Now you'll notice that I think I have less records than I did before. And so what that means is there are products before that aren't in the product table, and because I did that equal to, I now have less. And so if I'm concerned that, oh, that seems weird, maybe I have some old data that, you know, for whatever reason, somebody deleted out of the product table, maybe I want to include those again, I can do that. I might not know what the title is, but at least I would know what the product code was. And so now I get returned back. So I know now that the product code G15 is a modern mug. I can kind of see that people paid all kinds of different prices for these mugs, or they bought multiples. And if I'm wondering, oh, that seems odd, I could also put in, for example, like the quantity to know how many did they purchase. That kind of would help me understand if I'm looking for, you know, quantity to know when people were buying things. The other nice piece is I can take this out and export it to Excel and move the data around. I can also sort this in different ways. So I'm going to sort by name. I just clicked on the column heading. And I can see, oh, Alex Morgan, he has bought quite a few things. Donald has bought a few things. And so you can also kind of get a sense of who is buying, you know, different products. And you could also narrow it in if you're like, oh, I only want to see this particular product. And so really it's the ability to kind of narrow that in depending on how you want your data to be returned and kind of what you're looking for. So I am going to click on Save here and go back. If I go back to Define, like I said, the sources, I could have instead for product done the left join and run that instead. And you'll notice when I did that, now I'm back to getting that 198 records. And you'll notice that there are some products that just don't have a title, and that's just because they didn't have data back in the product table or product business object. And so that's kind of hopefully illustrates the difference between those particular types of join. All right, I am going to go back to Define and kind of take a look. Like I said, I updated the relationship there. I do want to come back to filters and talk about them a little bit more. Today what we did is we went in and added multiple filters. And so this is saying where activity type is equal to order. And what it does when I put them like this, so it just puts them one after another, I can keep adding them in and adding them in. It's saying it's this and this and this. So all of these things have to be true for it to return back information. Now if you're thinking I want this or this, you can go that route too. And so the ability to do that is instead of just hitting the drop down here, instead I could click on Add Filter. And when I do that, it puts in this box here that says this is the AND property. So if I added another field down here, say, let's go with a quantity greater than 1. I want to see who bought multiples. And I added this in. Because I used an AND, it would be essentially the same as me just adding it up here and not doing anything else at all. So that's one way to go. But I now have the ability to do something a little bit more complex where I can do the AND, and that's fine. I could do an AND not. So it has all of this has to be true, but not this. So it would give me only people that, or only activities, and the people that had those activities that had purchased a single item, so where the quantity was 1. The other thing we could do, though, here is the OR. So I could look for all of these things or any activity where the quantity is 1. And so it kind of gives you that flexibility where you're like, I want some of these people, or if they were this too, that's okay too. I want to see them in my list. So maybe they bought a couple of different products. maybe you're looking for those. Maybe you want to see, maybe they attended 2 different events, and you're saying, oh, they could have attended this event or this event. Bring them back in, and let's see a list of those people. Maybe I'm going to send mailing out to them, or whatever the case is. And so you have that ability as well, is to kind of change here what the property is. So you can do an or, and similarly kind of the or not, and say this has to be true or not this, and so it would be, again, kind of anybody greater than 1. So that's kind of the ability to do a little bit different pieces with the filtering, and sometimes that's needed if you're doing really those ors or things like that, or not, things that are not true. You have those abilities here. If you wanted to as well, I'm going to get rid of it and that. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that the prompt here was optional, and it keeps asking me about the transaction date. If I didn't like the prompt that it was giving me, I could instead say, put in a little message instead, and so when I run this, I say something like, please enter a date where transactions greater than will appear. However, you can put it more nicely. I'm definitely not a wordsmith, so that's another option as well. All right, I am going to then jump back over to my PowerPoint. So we talked about pulling in multiple business objects. We talked about the relationship. Like I said before, when we have 1 or more sources, there must be a relationship. If you don't, you're going to get a lot of records returned. The product is what's happening. And so if you're getting a ton of records and you wonder why, that could be one of the things. It also sometimes will just time out because there's just so many things it's trying to return. Like I said, iMIS may attempt to try to relate 2 business objects, and you can either keep that if you look at it and say, yes, it's correct, or I can delete it and manually do that. When I say manually, I say, oh, you know what, I'm going to choose a custom relationship, and I choose the fields, and then I choose the join, or the relationship type, really. Like I said before, the most common is equal, but left join is used in cases where you want all of the records from 1 business object and then additional information for the second business object. And that was where I said, oh, you know what, I pulled in product because I wanted to see the title, but some of the products weren't in that product business object. Like I said, they probably got deleted over time or something like that. So that's why I couldn't see them. We talked a little bit about filters. So the ability to add multiple filters, like I said, it assumes an and between your fields. If you don't want that, if you want it to be an or, you need to do the add filter. You click on that add filter button, and it'll go ahead and click and add that additional line where you can do the or, the and not, or the or not. And really that allows you specific operators. And one of the things that I like to think about when I'm doing filtering is I sometimes will say, oh, I keep kind of filtering down and filtering down where I might run it, see what I get, and then add a filter. It's like, yep, this is still looking good, still looking good. It's nothing's worse than adding 4 or 5 filters, running your query, and then finding, oh, you don't have any records, and you're trying to decide, I wonder which one is throwing me off. And so kind of trying to backtrack that. It's a little easier if you incrementally add them. All right, I think that is kind of the extent of what I have as far as things to show you with the intermediate kind of topics for IQA. Documentation can be found at help.imis.com. If you search for IQA, they have some good documentation there, so that'll kind of help you get started or kind of maybe refresh your memory if you're think, oh, I remember talking something about this. Take a look at help.imis.com. And then I think I'm open for questions.
Awesome. Excellent. There are no questions in the queue right now, so let me give folks a couple of minutes to type in their questions that they would like to ask Michelle. Or you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you as well. Anyone have any questions? I guess, Michelle, let's start it off by priming the pump. Do you have a common question that you're asked when people are getting involved with this?
I think it's a question is sometimes it's like, well, how do I know that I need to include something, or which join do I use? And that's probably the hardest to kind of think about. And again, you kind of have to go back to thinking, okay, when I was doing my relationship and I had the equals in, to me the equals is really the most restrictive. And so when I think about that, I'm like, oh, they have to exist in both business objects, so I have to have data in both spots for it to show up. If I think, I don't think I'm getting enough data, it might be time to say, oh, you know what, if it's not my filters, maybe it's that join, and maybe I should think about, okay, so I still want the records out of, say, for example, CS Contact, even if they don't have activity. If I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what I do want to see, that activity is nice to have, but I really want a list of people. You know, the other's kind of supplemental, then you might want to pick a left join. Like I said, if you think about building queries, I would say that's probably 90–95% fall in one of those two categories, and usually by far it's the equals. But it's kind of one of those you just get a little bit used to. You look at examples and kind of go that route.
Okay, excellent. All right, everybody. I hope you learned something great here today and pushes you a little bit forward here with iMIS. Thank you, Michelle. Great job as always. And again, we'll have a copy of this recording put out on our YouTube channel here within hours. So thank you, Michelle. Great job.